afternoon to everyone. A very warm welcome from all of us here at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. We're in our offices at the Maison de la Paix for the 2022 Innovation Night. We hope you all enjoy following this ceremony from your screens around the world. I'm Associate Fellow Dr. Paul Vallet, and it's my pleasure to be your host, accompanying you on this program. After an opening remarks from our director, Ambassador Thomas Greminger, and our jury president, Professor Nayef Al-Rodhan, our program will take place in two parts. To begin with, we're going to have a webinar from the GTF webinar series that's devoted to technological innovations in space. That will take us for the first hour. And after a short break from 16:15 Central European Time, our second part will consist in the Innovation Prize. I'll remind you that you're all participants entered in a prize draw to win places to the next Geopolitics and Global Futures Symposium that will take place in 2023, and we'll first announce the winners of that day and then proceed with the prize giving ceremony. So please bear with me now as we watch the welcome video that was recorded by the director of the GCSP, Ambassador Thomas Greminger.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to the GCSP Innovation Day, our annual event where we explore innovation and how it can help make the world a safer place. I would like to thank Professor Nayef Al-Rodhan, head of GCSP's Geopolitics and Global Futures program, and his team for organizing this event. We all understand the importance of innovation in our day-to-day lives and how it can transform the world. Innovation is unquestionably essential in times of turmoil. Equally important is our collaboration in this great endeavor to be more inventive and contribute to international peace and security. Innovation is not just scientific or technological. Dialogue, exchange of ideas, and analysis are essential components of innovation. And this is what the GCSP is all about. Through our inclusive environment, fostering discussions, dialogue, and analysis, we facilitate collaborative approaches in designing innovative, sustainable solutions for a more peaceful future. In this context, this webinar will start with a presentation and interactive discussions on technological innovations in space. As you probably know, through his research and publications, Nayef Al-Rodhan constantly highlights the importance of outer space as a new dimension in the struggle for sustainable global security. Technological innovations in space can be an effective agent for peace, and this is what we aim to put forward today in the first part of this webinar. In the second part of the webinar, we will be awarding the GCSP Prize for Innovation in Global Security. This international competition is now in its 8th edition and has seen increased participation year after year. Over the past years, the GCSP has been honored to recognize and reward some truly remarkable projects spanning various fields and formats, including grassroots level cooperation projects, mobile applications, and international training and capacity building projects. In these times of turmoil, we are facing this year's proposals offer some hope and creative ideas to overcome significant global challenges. Make sure to stay until the end of this webinar to discover who this year's winners are and learn more about what sparks their innovative thinking. Again, I'm very pleased that so many of you are gathered today for GCSP Innovation Day. All of you can be agents of change, and I can only encourage you to support sharing of ideas and scaling up good practices toward a more peaceful and secure future. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you all an innovative and fruitful webinar.
Thanking Ambassador Greminger for these welcoming remarks, I will now pass the floor to Professor Nayef Al-Rodhan for his introductory remarks to the webinar.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ambassador Greminger. Welcome to all of you, and especially to our panelists. I see you, Lauren and General Blattman. Very good to see you. The first part of the afternoon is, as you heard, a keynote speech by a distinguished friend of our program, Thomas Roberts, who hails from the MIT and CSIS in Washington. He's participated in our space panels over the years. And today he's going to talk to us about innovations, technological innovations in outer space. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my slides. I hope you can see them. Let's see. Okay. Well, thank you, Professor, and thank you to the GCSP Innovation Day Organizing Committee for inviting me to join today's event in honor of this year's prize winners. I'm here to talk to you about innovation in space technologies, new ideas in outer space engineering that are poised to change the way we live our lives here on Earth. But in doing so, I want to offer an inspiring new framework to think about these technologies, one that acknowledges where the space industry is in relation to both its brief, storied history and what I hope will be its long, rich future, offering not just years and decades, but millennia of opportunity for Earth and spacefaring humans. In today's remarks, I'll highlight innovative space technologies that contribute to the long-term sustainability of the near-Earth space environment in two ways. First, those that contribute to the prevention of a catastrophic destabilization of the space domain, or at its worst, its annihilation. And second, those that alter the trajectory of inter-operator dynamics and contribute to a safer future with small actions that accumulate more sustainable outcomes over time. Both of these concepts are directly borrowed from a concept known as long-termism, most often discussed by contemporary philosophers dedicated to the study of rationality in altruistic behavior. The near-Earth space environment today would be unrecognizable to the world's earliest space operators. More than 65 years ago, when the first artificial satellite carved its trajectory around the Earth at thousands of kilometers per second, the human race entered a new era. Human engineered technologies were no longer constrained to the land, sea, and air domains, but instead could expand somewhere new, vast, and at the time, empty. Since then, the near-Earth space environment has enjoyed consistent year-over-year population growth, with more and more actively controlled satellites maintaining orbits around the Earth. With new entrants to the space object population have come revolutionary space-enabled technologies that fundamentally change the way the global community behaves. From telecommunication systems, allowing real-time communications from one side of the Earth to the other, to precise position, navigation, and timing systems that tell us where we are, where we're going, and when we'll get there. The latest satellite technologies offer new promises, previously unimaginable. Think high-speed broadband internet connection, or high-resolution live images of every corner of the Earth's surface at every moment of every day. But this promise comes with a cost, an explosion of the space object population, and with it, the future of the near-Earth space environment as we know it. The first space age, from 1957 to the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, was marked by approximately linear growth in the active satellite population. Since then, the near-Earth space environment population is better modeled with exponential growth. To some observers, this population signature could be recognized for its resemblance to a condensed version of the history of the human population. For the past 1,000 years, the human population, and most of that time growing consistently, but slowly. Then the Industrial Revolution inspired a fundamental change. New technologies helped more adults reach longer lifetimes and more children survive the first years of life. But that pattern is daunting. In the broad scheme of the human race, the number of human lives lived thus far is dwarfed by those that are yet to come. Future generations that could be poised to continue revolutionizing the human experience by, among other things, continuing to innovate in the space domain. This perspective, that the human race is in its infancy in the broader scheme of generational timescales, forms the foundation of long-termism, a philosophy that pulls future human potential from the margins of human decision-making to the center. Popularized by Oxford philosopher William McCaskill, long-termism is defined as the idea that positively influencing the long-term future is a key moral priority of our time. In the space domain, long-termists may be inclined to sacrifice value earned today, which could come in the form of satellite operational lifetimes, on-orbit propellant, or ideal operating conditions, for value preserved for tomorrow, a peaceful and sustainable space domain for generations to come. When objects collide in orbit with one another, the results are catastrophic. Both objects are subject to fragmentation, the high-speed breakup of satellites and their components. After a breakup event, fragments are locked in uncontrolled orbits of their own, often intersecting with those of other active satellites and threatening their operations with a similar high-speed collision. Although such satellite-on-satellite collisions are rare, intentional kinetic anti-satellite, or ASAT weapons, which is the demonstration of a missile technology designed to launch directly into a satellite's trajectory on purpose, are less so. Russia, the United States, China, and India have each demonstrated ASAT technologies, slammed missiles into orbiting target satellites, and collectively generated thousands of pieces of traceable space debris in the process. And in a wartime scenario, adversaries may be tempted to deploy such counter-space technologies to disrupt, degrade, or destroy critical space system benefits as part of an offensive strike in response to an attack or threat, either in the space domain or some other operational one. New technologies developed in the past decade, however, have fortunately reduced this threat by allowing civil government, military, and commercial space systems operators to disaggregate their satellite systems across many satellites in different orbital phases and planes, such that striking a single satellite no longer yields such great strategic benefit. This transition from big, singular, juicy targets, as they were once described by former Vice Chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Hyten, to tens or hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of smaller satellites that together contribute to a broader mission that's been made possible by a number of key, innovative technological advances, including spacecraft miniaturization and the reduced cost of launch. Since the dawn of the space age, satellites have become more capable and physically smaller due to the advances in the ratio of computational processor performance to mass, economies of scale, and the effective micronization of satellite architectures as part of the ubiquitous CubeSat design, in which small form factor satellite buses become more and more capable of performing the missions that once required systems of much larger dimensions and mass. Additionally, space systems can be deployed to space by a much more cost-effective suite of commercial space launch providers, competing every day to provide customers with ever-falling prices and improved success rates due to innovative technologies such as first-stage reusability and ride sharing. But in order to preserve the space domain for generations to come, the international space community must do more than preserve its mere existence, prevent those catastrophes I was describing earlier. Just as the world today has grown to depend on space assets for everyday life, Think from mapping our daily commutes to detecting the launch of a nuclear warhead from a foreign adversary. Future generations, too, deserve to benefit from new technologies not yet developed, but just as dependent on satellite systems. Long-termist space operators must dedicate themselves to smaller changes in practice that together reduce the risk of on-orbit collision and promote the safe densification of the most popular orbital regimes. Such practices include improved space situational awareness, automated collision avoidance, active debris removal, and, when appropriate, mission extension technologies. So space situational awareness I mentioned first. That's the practice of detecting, characterizing, and tracking space objects in orbit by passive and active data collection. This is what I work on every day as an astrodynamicist at MIT. And it's the bread and butter of our understanding of the near-Earth space environment, where satellites are, and what risk they pose of colliding with one another. Once a practice of only national governments with significant investments in space operations, space situational awareness is now a competitive commercial industry with new private actors dedicated to using both ground and space-based optical, infrared, and radar sensors to offer exquisite information about space object behavior and lowering uncertainties and contributing to more accurate space object diagnostics and threat analysis. Better space situational awareness directly contributes to a safer, denser, near-Earth space environment. Automated collision avoidance, or using software to automatically fire thrusters to lower the probability of collision during normal operations, as opposed to depending on human-planned collision avoidance maneuvers, sending emails to one another and clicking buttons to fire thrusters on satellites. Automated collision avoidance directly exemplifies long-termist practices in space operations. Using a small amount of fuel today, which does effectively shorten the operational lifetime of a satellite, to perform more frequent but relatively small maneuvers, is a cost borne by operators to lower the risk of collision to a constellation of satellites over time, also known as the ensemble risk of a broad network of assets. Such technology may depend on machine-learned models that describe the space environment using space situational awareness data analyzed on the ground, but communicated to satellites mid-flight. Active debris removal is the practice of identifying particularly threatening pieces of uncontrolled debris, traditionally, and designing missions to remove them from popular orbits, either by relocating them to lower altitudes, where they'll be susceptible to atmospheric degradation, or higher, less used orbits where they pose a near zero threat of collision with active satellites. Such technologies, which continue to be developed and demonstrated, depend on precise rendezvous and proximity operations, in which satellite operators must perform close approaches with targets, grapple them or otherwise engage with them without crashing into them in the process, and safely remove them from orbit. Like any space mission, active debris removal may seem costly today, but directly works to ensure safe future space operations. And lastly, mission extension vehicles work to offset an age-old space operation paradigm that satellites, once you launch them to orbit, only operate for a limited amount of time before they themselves become derelict and a part of the space debris problem. To do so, mission extension vehicles perform rendezvous and proximity operations to repair, refuel, or redirect host satellites after they suffer perhaps on-orbit anomalies or reach the end of their planned operational lifetimes. Like the Industrial Revolution contributed better health outcomes to the world's population, innovative automated mission extension vehicles demonstrated in recent years have the potential to both increase the average age of satellites and prevent infant mortality, if you will, by giving hosts a second lease on life after unforeseen but solvable mission-threatening issues are observed. Despite the title of my remarks today, Innovative space technologies, as the director mentioned earlier, represent only a fraction of the long-termist's toolbox in outer space. As an international space community, we cannot rely on just new developments in space engineering to prevent catastrophe or do our best to reduce the threat of overcongestion. We must also turn to one another, agree upon our concerns, and adopt new social practices to respond to a quickly changing near-Earth space environment. As the world's first satellite bolted around the Earth decades ago, it faced a vast, unpopulated environment. The same satellite today would be operating in a completely different domain, one increasingly full of both actively controlled space objects, but also waste product, the product of decades of vibrant space operations. And so orbiting the Earth today, I think, should require a fundamentally different rule book. While some actors have admirably agreed to refrain from testing anti-satellite weapons that create uncontrolled debris, other policies remain unadopted that too could contribute to a safer operational space environment for generations to come. Responsible national governments should, for example, offer lines of communication with one another to discuss uncoordinated conjunctions or close approaches, engagements in which satellites come near to one another during regular operations. They should share one another's phone numbers. So if a crash is coming up on the horizon, one operator knows who to call to have a discussion about how to prevent or mitigate that risk of collision. Space environment administrators should invest in better understanding the effectiveness of orbital slotting frameworks in which satellite operators are licensed to control satellites in particular locations in space via a license application process, committed to preserving the space domain for both current actors, but also developing ones that have yet to place a satellite in orbit, because space belongs to them too. And perhaps most importantly, satellite operators must unshroud themselves from the legacy of secretive space operations and start sharing information about their satellites' historical and planned behaviors, encourage coordination in congested space operations, and trust one another in their commitment to a long-term preservation of the environment. I look forward to both my generation and those that are yet to come to benefit from exciting new innovations in space technologies and the potential for more sustainable international space policies with admiration and hope. We are living in a truly unique time. May we take advantage of such a position and harness its power. So please join me in thanking our hosts this afternoon in Geneva and for this opportunity to speak with you. I'm looking forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Insightful as always. Maybe I'll kick off. We have about 20 minutes, so please enter your questions in the Q&A function. But to get the ball rolling, maybe I can pick your brain a little bit, Thomas. Given the fact that outer space is a global commons, that humanity is increasingly and irreversibly overdependent on outer space in peace and war, and given the fact that we need each other, given all of these wonderful prerequisites, why is it so hard? I mean, I kind of know part of the answer, but I need your wisdom today. Why is it so hard for at least major space powers sit down and update outdated space treaties, go for the low-lying fruit like space traffic management and situational awareness? You mentioned earlier that why don't they tell each other and be more transparent about, where their assets are? But, is it the national security concerns, both corporate and military and security, will always get in the way of being transparent enough to have enough coordination between the major space powers to keep outer space decluttered, safe, and secure?
I think the main roadblock to that sort of environment you're describing is the vibrancy of the threat environment we live in the space domain. Those great powers you speak of, the United States, I'm okay to name them. The United States, Russia, and China have made a practice of tossing out threats towards one another, not just towards their military space assets, but also commercial space platforms that support military operations. And why do they do that? Because satellite systems are, because we rely so much on them, as you said, yet they're so vulnerable. In some of our previous discussions, and whatever, I've had the privilege of speaking to your groups in the past, is about the ways in which satellites can be threatened. What can we do, or what can a foreign adversary do to disrupt, degrade, or even destroy a satellite entirely? And I argue that that playbook is sort of dauntingly big. And the dependence that we have on space assets is, in my opinion, at a juxtaposition with how easy it is to take those privileges away. So until space systems become less vulnerable through what I argue to be a number of pathways to do that, until the benefit from striking a satellite or threatening to strike a satellite, until that benefit shrinks, I suspect we will continue to live in a threat environment, and one in which it's difficult to come to agreements on how to use counter space weapons, on how to develop norms of behavior for peaceful space operations, when the likelihood of the space domain being an operational warfighting domain, not one in which that hosts militarized platforms, which has been for decades, but rather the battlefield for a conflict between great powers. Because that potential is so great, and I suspect it will stay that way for some time, this is not an ideal environment for the sorts of peaceful decision-making that are required to build upon the Outer Space Treaty, develop new frameworks, perhaps even lower than the international treaty level, to describe planning for space traffic management. The environment isn't ideal. But I believe we are making progress, and it's a combination of innovations happening from space engineers on the technical side, and also from international discussions and policy. These are happening in tandem. I like the direction things are going, but I recognize the challenges you mentioned, and I think we'll face them for some time.
I mean, given the fact that outer space, if it becomes critically unsafe, it will not be selectively unsafe. It will be unsafe for everyone. I'm still puzzled as to why, but you mentioned something that's very insightful, is maybe it's the vulnerability of various space assets that's making people nervous about being cooperative. But given the fact everyone will be hurt, I'm still, maybe I'm too naive, but I'm still surprised that they can't get around the table and at least address the basic issues like space traffic management, just as a start off. But maybe the corporate side of it, it's a space is, as you know, is trillions worth of dollars in terms of economy. You think what part is that playing in terms of the Holden's cards close to one's vest in the global community?
I think we're learning about that right now. So in the conflict in Ukraine, for example, it's both military satellite systems that are benefiting Ukrainian forces, and Russian forces continue to depend on Russian aerospace forces operated satellites. But there's also a significant contribution from commercial space systems. So one that makes headlines for those in the space policy community on a daily or weekly basis is the dependence of Ukrainian military forces on broadband internet offered by Starlink, a commercial subsidiary of SpaceX, a mega constellation of thousands of satellites that together offer broadband internet to remote areas that may not have a wired connection or face destruction of civil infrastructures that may have once offered it to them, as is the case in the battlefield in Ukraine. And threats towards space systems have transcended from traditionally targeting systems operated by militaries to Starlink. So there have been threats from the upper echelons of the Russian government of what counter-space technologies it possesses to disrupt or degrade Starlink services. And frankly, it already has. There are many ways to threaten satellites, the most destructive of which is launching a direct descent anti-satellite weapon or a co-orbital anti-satellite weapon, destroying it physically. But you can also disrupt satellite services by jamming its communications, which is a favorite activity for the Russians to do. And that's something that's happened for both military systems and commercial systems. But Starlink offers services to thousands of customers, not just the Ukrainian military. So it inspires interesting questions about the intersection between commercial space actors, companies that are trying to make money and are doing so in the space domain, and intergovernmental conflicts in which they happen to support as customers and service providers, but are distinctly separate from. And the treaties that govern space environment frankly did not predict this operating environment with a mixture of civil, military, and commercial operators. Because the space domain of 1967, when the fundamental agreement was written, looked nothing like what we see today, in which the number of military satellites is dwarfed by the thousands of commercially operated satellites. Okay,
thank you. There's a question about the life cycle of space satellite communication. And as a follow-up, that's from the chat function, but as a follow-up to that, you're aware of the FCC, a new idea of limiting, that making people commit to deorbiting dysfunctional satellites within 5 years. Maybe it's linked. Could you address that, please?
Sure. So for those not familiar, there's been a proposal at the level of the United States federal government on this is the agency responsible for governing radio communication signals. So decongesting the radio frequency spectrum in space. This also happens at the international level, at the International Telecommunications Union, a specialized agency of the United Nations headquartered just down the road in Geneva. And the proposal is that satellite operators that earn licenses to communicate in the radio frequency spectrum, which is almost all satellites, the vast majority of satellites depend on traditional radio communications to propagate signals to and from terminals on the Earth's surface. The FCC has suggested new rules where in order to earn their license, satellite operators must commit to deorbiting their satellites after a given number of years. The idea is that as we contribute more and more satellites to the space domain, there's a plan for what to do when those satellites reach their end of life. There's no international treaty requiring satellite operators to remove derelict satellites that are no longer functioning because they ran out of fuel, they reached the end of their operational mission lifetime, or perhaps they suffered an on-orbit anomaly causing their operations to cease. There's no rule saying they have to remove themselves from wherever they currently are. And that historical problem has contributed to congestion and the increased risk of collision. There has been collisions between inactive objects and one another. And there's a threat of a cascading problem where those collisions happen more and more often. Because as space is vast, the number of operational orbits that are popular to commercial and military and civil space operators is limited. People want to be in the same places in space. There's a number of particularly high value orbital regimes where satellite operators tend to go, and they tend to leave their satellites once they're gone. So taking your satellites away after your operational lifetime contributes to what is often called the sink in a fundamental source sink evolutionary model of the space domain, where satellites come through launch and they leave through retirement maneuvers that pull them outside of the domain. I think that requiring operators to remove themselves from orbit is a fundamentally good idea. Choosing a particular number of years, I think, could be construed as inappropriate, as it suggests that all satellites are designed in sort of the same ways, and that satellites aren't particularly designed to have their mission lifetimes extended through other innovative space technologies that might be able to do so, or that all regimes would directly benefit from such maneuvers. In some cases, maneuvering a satellite outside of that most popular area is enough to prevent the risk of collision. Let it fall almost to zero. A fantastic example is the geostationary Earth orbit, a specific orbital regime at which satellites orbit the Earth at the same rate that the Earth turns upon its own axis. My area of expertise in astrodynamics, is in that domain. Asking a satellite operator after the end of a geosatellite's lifetime to drag their satellite tens of thousands of kilometers back to the Earth's surface to burn up in the atmosphere, contributing, by the way, to a different environmental problem. Actors have agreed to remove their satellites from geostationary orbit by just increasing their altitude by a few hundred kilometers, populating what's known as a graveyard orbit. Just a few hundred kilometers above geo, satellites no longer benefit from that geosynchronicity of Earth orbit. And so it's not a very popular orbital regime up there. And a few small maneuvers that are low cost have reduced the threat of satellite-on-satellite collision in geo almost down to zero. That particular orbital regime has enjoyed safety in the decades of operations it's seen. There's never been a collision between satellites in geo. And that's in part due to the practice of removing your satellite from orbit, but not necessarily deorbiting it or burning it up in the atmosphere.
I'm combining two questions from the Q&A function in the interest of time. And that is, what is the way forward in terms of space traffic management and potential demilitarization of outer space?
Oh, the second question I think is much easier than the first, in that I don't foresee a demilitarization of outer space. Militaries around the world, despite growing in their force structure, in their capabilities across various domains, these different technologies have grown to depend on space systems. Deploying forces on the ground all the way across the Earth, commanded by an operational combatant command thousands of miles away, depends on SATCOM, satellite communications, that is protected, where you can privately communicate with forces on the ground and ensure their safety, despite an operator not being there themselves. Or precision munition guiding, launching a missile or any sort of guided ammunition from one location on the Earth's surface to another depends on the encrypted military GPS signal to make sure you know where your weapons are going. I do not foresee militaries reducing their dependence on such technologies. Instead, quite the opposite, where new innovations become available through space-enabled technologies, changing the landscape of warfighting. So that was an easier question, and then perhaps not the answer that you want. And the first, where do I foresee things going in terms of space traffic management? I think there is a very interesting conversation going on in space situational awareness and space traffic management policy, at least in the United States, happening right now. It's very common to think about that growth chart I was showing before and where we are. We're beyond an inflection point, to suggest that the growth of the satellite population is not exponential, is poor education in mathematics, not a hot take that is popular anymore in the space domain. And so we have to do something about that. And a popular proposal is orbital slotting formulations for low Earth orbit. So that's taking systems that are actually already in place in geostationary orbit, for example, in which satellite operators apply for licenses, not just for radio communication frequencies to prevent harmful interference with one another, but physical locations where in geo, in this example, they're allowed to propagate those signals. A slotting framework does not exist for low Earth orbit, the most popular orbital regime by far, and the one facing the greatest threat of overcongestion. In that animation I was showing earlier from talented colleagues at ComSpoc and Analytical Graphics, we can see just the visualization of what it will look like when tens of thousands of more satellites join LEO in popular orbital shells, where some of these proposals to radio communication regulators look very similar, and they're uncoordinated, meaning these operators don't talk to one another when proposing these constellations. So an orbital slotting framework would develop a formulation for there to be some sort of arbitrator, perhaps a radio communications regulator like is done at the ITU, but maybe at the national level, coordinating these different proposals and arguing that if satellite operators know where one another are, where they will be, and what sorts of schema are used to maintain orbits through station keeping technologies. What's going to happen for these planned missions to allow satellites to orbit much more closely with one another than ever before? When we understand where satellites are, we rarely received active data, meaning exact state positions and vectors from satellite operators. Instead, because of the culture of secrecy in outer space, we depend on passive observation. Frankly, just staring at the sky with various technologies and trying our best, squinting our eyes and looking at where satellites are. And such a process results in serious uncertainties. So when I think of satellites zooming around in my field of view, if I'm a telescope on the ground looking up, I actually model these satellites as much bigger ellipsoids, in which in the case of, I don't actually know where the satellite is in that geometry. I know it's somewhere in that domain. But if we shared information about where satellites are through active data sharing, those ellipsoids become much smaller. They become the size of a satellite and just a little bit bigger. And that allows for these orbital slotting frameworks to actually make a lot of sense for a complicated low Earth orbit environment. So that's sort of my answer to the space traffic management question. I think the next fundamental conversation we will have in space traffic management is orbital slotting in LEO, a challenging, really juicy problem for the astrodynamicists of our age.
Okay, we're almost running out of time, but maybe I'll combine three questions together. And it has to do with innovation, given the day, the focus of the day. So what particular directions of major space powers in terms of innovation, technological innovations in outer space are pivotal to terrestrial security or insecurity, in terms of the military security realm, but also in terms of benefits to humanity, like climate change, arms control, etc.
I think a number of the technologies I highlighted earlier are in the commercial space. The people building better and better cameras and launching more and more satellites to take photos and perform remote sensing are private companies. They exist because they can sell data to federal governments, but it's commercial leaders that are changing the landscape, and that makes me so excited to be a part of the space industry. But defense of terrestrial activities comes in many forms. To prevent war between adversaries on the ground is critical and a mission focus of my career and that of many of my colleagues. But there are also fundamental threats that have nothing to do with conflicts on the ground between governments or militaries, but rather as a planetary species, as this Earth orbits around the Earth, it's passing through a natural environment. Our solar system, our galaxy, our little corner of the universe, which from time to time faces visitors. Natural asteroids or comets that follow less predictable trajectories that come near the Earth during, regular, I could describe it as regular operations, but the natural precession of Earth around the sun. And through thousands of years, the probability of being struck by a massive asteroid is small, but distinctly non-zero. And so when so many commercial companies are developing so many of the technologies we see in our pockets and on our phones, civil space actors like NASA or the European Space Agency could focus on planetary threats. Like, what can we do to reduce the probability of collision with a natural asteroid? And so some technologies that are at the cusp of innovation that are happening right now are asking questions like, can we redirect an asteroid that's on a collision course with the Earth? Can we send a tiny low mass projectile, a small satellite, towards an asteroid and cause a tiny perturbation in its direction of motion, enough to save the Earth and prevent a catastrophic collision? That question is being answered through missions that are being developed and already launched, already deployed right now. So I wanted to highlight NASA's DART mission, which does just that, asteroid redirection. I think those sorts of missions are made possible because there are so many new actors that are contributing to innovation in space, and that leaves room for interplanetary questions and sort of the largest collaborative efforts that are going to be needed to preserve the planetary environment completely outside of the politics of how we interact with one another as humans.
Thank you. One more question regarding what kind of innovations may help in increasing parity and reducing disparities between states for the benefit of a more stable and secure outer space domain.
The cost of entry to the space domain is falling every day. So it used to be that if you wanted to put a satellite in space, you needed to develop a national space infrastructure. You needed space launch vehicles developed by your local military. You needed launch sites that are in your homeland territory. You need a trajectory in which you can track using telemetry missiles as they're launched to orbit. You need to have locations that are thousands of miles away. And only a small number of space operators could ever feasibly do that, or would ever make strategic sense to do such a thing. But the space environment has entirely changed, where commercial actors can do all of the work for you. They can build that rocket, they can build these satellites, and instead sell you small bits of data collected by such systems, which lowers the threshold of entry to new emerging space actors all the way to the floor. And we've seen what that change has done. From the first space age, in which we saw that small but consistent linear growth, that was the behavior of a small handful of actors. And it wasn't until the second space age where we saw a burst of both commercialization, the development of new private companies launching satellites to space, but also new federal actors, new space agencies that weren't one of the big three launching satellites to space. In doing so, we have to protect those futures. That's sort of the long-termist view that I was highlighting earlier. Those emerging space actors have a bright future for participating in the space domain, but we have to give them a chance to do it. When we're developing orbital slotting frameworks, for instance, we cannot create enough slots just for the number of actors today and their proposals for the future. We must carve away a small fraction of this near-Earth space environment, a few orbital slots, for actors that don't exist yet, that are committed to contributing to the space environment and reaping its benefits, but are not far enough along to put a satellite into orbit today or tomorrow, or even apply for a license as part of this application structure. We've seen that happen to mixed success at the international level in the international telecommunications in GEO, in that particular orbital regime, where some slots are preserved for emerging space nations, which is a critical part of the agreement of the International Telecommunications Convention that forms the foundation of ITU communications. I hope to see something similar in the future of space traffic management in LEO. We hear from these emerging space actors. They want to play. They want to be in on this, and we have to leave room for them to see where that space environment takes us. One that serves more people around the Earth, not just as customers for commercial space operations, but for actors themselves.
Thank you. On the positive side, as you know, the US admirably declared a unilateral ban on ASAT tests. It's been joined by a few states. Why is there a reluctance for everyone to join? Because it seems to be a no-brainer to prevent cluttering the space. Or is it because people think they haven't had a chance to innovate and able to do this in terms of capacity building?
So we haven't seen critical actors sign the moratorium on creating space debris as part of ASAT demonstrations, because the era of ASAT demonstrations is still upon us. And that I believe there are more actors willing to demonstrate and perfect these technologies. They've never been used in a conflict. There's never been a conflict in the space domain between space actors that is part of a concerted attack. And so all of these tests that have generated thousands of pieces of debris are between an actor testing a space launch vehicle on one of their own satellites, for which they have excellent telemetry. They know exactly where that satellite is. It's challenging to what is effectively pointing a gun at the sky and firing a bullet directly into a target hundreds of kilometers away. That's hard. And I think that a lot of these actors will continue to be testing these technologies A few of them commit to doing so in such a way that doesn't create any debris, which is certainly possible. You can design an anti-satellite test that strikes an empty patch of the outer space environment and can still be measured as successful. Prior to Russia's destructive ASAT test last year, that was their methodology for decades, extending to the earliest ages of the Soviet Union. But I think that there are more tests to come. And so there's a reluctancy comes from a failure for some of these actors to commit to not using these technologies in operation, but rather holding on to the capability of threatening other satellite systems with these technologies. These threats become extremely real when we can measure their success. We can attribute that particular attack to the perpetrator. In many ways, I think it's very funny that the history of space operations is so secretive, because unlike the submarine below the ocean surface, which we have such trouble tracking despite all the advances in technology today, the space domain is just there in our backyard. We can look up at the sky and see it. In some ways, there are no secrets in space. I can see where your satellites are, and very, very exquisite telescope systems have been developed to continue tracking satellites, even when they perform maneuvers that make it difficult to maintain custody over them. So it's when an attack occurs, all actors around the world can confirm that really did happen, and that success is not an opinion of the operator that performed the test, but rather an agreed upon fact by the global community. And that strengthens the threat to surface level. It's a capability that space powers hold close. And I don't think we'll see all countries sign such a moratorium until the development of counter space weapons continues in a few particular countries that haven't quite reached their goals yet in this category.
A question from the chat function on the Artemis program, which is so exciting and now looping in its 25-day journey, unmanned, of course. The question says, could you comment on the Artemis program's role in long-term space governance? In particular, the view of some that it seeks to undermine the existing space governance regime, in particular to relation to resource exploration. I mean, I don't think they're connected, but I'm just reciting the question as it is. Go ahead, please.
Sure. So the Artemis program is an opportunity to continue collaborations in civil human spaceflight. And that's a particular corner of space operations, but one with the richest history in successful civil collaboration. Despite being in a proxy war on the ground, the United States and Russia continue to collaborate on a daily basis in the previous best example of international collaboration, I argue in science in general, but certainly in civil human spaceflight, which is the International Space Station. Such a mission is the result of not a singular multinational agreement between the various partner agencies that contribute to the International Space Station, but many bilateral small ones. It's practice communicating with space actors around the world, both allies and adversaries, to come to a common goal, share values, and earn a better understanding of various commitments to important values in the space community, including space sustainability. So the International Space Station is retiring. It was never designed to last forever, and we're quickly approaching the end of its operational lifetime. And so the Artemis program, to me, represents the next chapter in international collaboration, a breeding ground for where these bilateral and multilateral conversations can happen. We haven't seen an extension of U.S.-Russian relations in civil human space flights for the Artemis program specifically, but I remain optimistic because I know firsthand the power of civil human space flight in its ability to break through barriers that we cannot do for whatever reason in other domains. We cannot have these conversations. In some cases, because of policy, there's what's known as the Wolf Amendment in the United States, preventing bilateral conversations between NASA and the Chinese Space Civil Agency counterpart. There are real roadblocks to some of these conversations that I believe need to be happening for the development of norms of behavior, which I think is the most important thing we're missing in the international space domain. The second half of the question, I believe, was about resources on the lunar surface. And I think that question is becoming more and more pertinent as the Artemis program, unlike the International Space Station, locked in low altitude orbit around the Earth, the Artemis program extends deep into cislunar space and in some components around the moon in lunar orbit. And there will one day be lunar surface operations, sparking questions of not sovereignty, which is covered by the Outer Space Treaty. They got a lot of things right in 1967 to protect celestial bodies from actors staking claim or claiming different regions of orbital regimes or even patches of the lunar surface as extensions of their countries here on Earth. But it sparks really important questions on practices. I think that's what you're going for in that question, where if perhaps an American and its allies Artemis mission were to create a science lab on the surface of the moon, measuring, among many other things, radiation from the sun, patterns from like lunar surface patterns, measuring the impact of various meteoroids striking the lunar surface, a delicate series of scientific missions that is a laboratory environment that you don't want to disturb. It costs a lot of money to get there, and a nearby Chinese vehicle performing a landing nearby, kicking up thousands of kilograms of tiny particles of lunar dust could challenge some of the operations we see. And that is a scenario that hasn't happened, but very well could. These various space agencies are targeting similar locations on the lunar surface, of which none of them have any claim to be operating there. But practice could lead to a new paradigm of how operators behave in new places in space, both in orbit and on celestial bodies. So I think we need to develop a rule book, a lunar policy handbook on how to deal with those sorts of interactions before they come to fruition. In the same way that the Outer Space Treaty imagined a space future well before it became a vibrant domain that it is now. And in some cases, I mentioned they got it right. And in other cases, they imagined things a bit wrong. The Outer Space Treaty spends some time talking about astronaut rescue and recovery, imagining an economy in which astronauts are literally falling from the sky in unplanned locations. And a Soviet astronaut might find his way in Kansas. And we have to come up with the solution for what we'll do in that very specific scenario. So the cost of thinking ahead and thinking of strategic futures comes with getting it wrong sometimes. But I think that that is fundamental work that needs to be happening. And programs like the Artemis program and its corresponding accords is the right place to do that. I believe we've seen that success happen in its predecessor programs, and I really look forward to a hopeful future with Artemis as a vehicle and other similar programs that are on the horizon to be the breeding ground for these sorts of conversations that I think need to be happening.
I fully agree, Thomas. I think given the fact the Outer Space Treaty prohibits appropriation of any part of any celestial body, if you look at the maps, the potential maps on the lunar South Pole, potential landing sites or potential setting up shop, if you like, between the Chinese and the Americans, they're awfully similar. I mean, they're awfully superimposed almost, not quite. So I can foresee, like you do, if somebody invests a lot of money and know-how and set up shop someplace, and the jurisprudence and the potential conflict and arbitration is going to be a serious issue. And I don't think anybody is going to invest a lot of money and not be willing to defend that capacity building somewhere in the South Pole to begin with, at least. Don't you think?
The incompatibility of the various proposals to operate on the lunar surface is almost comical. There's no communication between these actors. These visions for the lunar surface future cannot both happen. So I don't know exactly what it will look like, but perhaps we're engaging in sort of a bit of a race, because I think these practices that I'm sort of envisioning of how to treat one another in the space environment, they're informed by behavior that actually happens between these same actors, these same governments on the ground or at sea. We know a little bit about how foreign adversaries behave in these environments. And so I'm curious to see how the lunar surface will look, how the South Pole will become terraformed, and like how similar it will be to either of those maps. I think there's an element of who gets there first. That's sort of the history of space operations loves the race, and I think we might have another one on our hands.
I worry that it's whoever gets first is probably the scenario. I'm interested in astroneurobiology in addition to the technological and policy aspects of outer space, and the long-termism you talked about, and the sustainability of human life in outer, never mind deep space, is going to be very challenging because, in our current biological form, there's no way we're going to make it. We just can't do it. Not only because of solar and cosmic radiation, but of our innate biological vulnerabilities. You're aware of the twin Kelly studies. 93% of Kelly, now the Senator Kelly, when he went up there to the ISS for about a year, 93% of his genes were fine, but 7% were not. And that had to do a lot with gene expression and telomere. That's innovation, but in the biological realm. But it will require biotechnological solutions. And the good news is, after he came back 6 months later, most of that was reversed. But we were given the potential epigenetic changes. We have no clue what's going to happen down the line. And there was a lot of recent work, as you may have seen, in terms of pregnancy in space. Turns out, from a neurobiological standpoint, the way neurons grow both during gestation and the latter part of pregnancy has a lot to do with gravity in terms of axonal and dendritic growth. And we know in space, in animals, at least in mammals, fish and do fine. Frogs and fish do, but mammals like mice don't do well at all. Everything is messed up. Because if we're going to colonize space in some capacity, we're going to make babies up there, I presume, or at least have babies grow up there. And we're a long ways from I think settling there in a biologically survivable way. That's just an adjunct to the technology I just wanted to mention. We're almost out of time. Any final words from you, Thomas? Just take-home messages.
Well, I think I appreciate the long-termist views. I'm still deciding whether I personally fit in that paradigm, but I think that it honors where we are in the history of space operations, where I think a lot of space operators can agree that actions chosen now have an outsized impact on this huge population that is right before us. We have a lot of license application structures in place already. We know almost exactly what some of these proposed missions will look like. Operators like Amazon have not just filed for licenses and effectively told the world about their plans to launch tens of thousands of satellites to low Earth orbit, but paid the price. They've bought rockets in order to put those satellites into space. This is really happening. And so the decision-making process that's before us, how to create norms of behavior in the space domain, have been before us in the history of space operations, but never has the call for doing something about it been louder. And I think this long-termism frame of thinking can offer a few more pressing voices to have these conversations now, not to wait until some of these mega constellations contribute to the space object population, but to do so now. To predict problems, because we know what they look like. The modeling is good. We know what this problem and how it will develop over time. Why can't we have these conversations now? I argue we should. So I thank the philosophers out in Oxford for helping me think through this problem in this new way, because I think it can bring in a few more people into this conversation, and that's what it will take to see real change.
Just a quick comment on that. I mean, I know those people very well. They're friends, and the long-termism that they talk about, and I've engaged with them in terms of space. Also, it's long-termism. it's really their outlook is thousands of years. It's not even decades. So for me, it's inconceivable that you can have any intelligent conversation about anything more than a decade, never mind a century or a millennium. I think the idea of normatively thinking about the future but the long-termism that McCaskill talks about is really thousands of years issues. So I don't think it's really relevant to our space environment, because that's not what they mean. It's not an immediate, what I mean by immediate is the century. So they're thinking way beyond that, because I've engaged with them in that capacity. But I think, to me, the normative, what's holding up the obvious is really, to me, in a very simplistic way, is the national interest. I think there's very little trust building out there globally, and people are not secure enough or to be transparent enough to get to somewhere useful and safe. Thank you, Thomas. Wonderful to engage with you as always very thoughtful and thought-provoking. Please join me in thanking our great friend, Thomas from MIT CSIS for his wonderful talk and discussion. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
And now back to Paul. Paul, back to you.
Thank you, Professor Al-Rodhan, and to Thomas Roberts for a really quite fascinating discussion. So many themes that we've been able to cover in 1 hour. So we'll now break for 15 minutes, and we will reconvene at 1:30 for the second part of the program, which is the prize-giving ceremony. Thank you very much. All right, it's 4:30, so please welcome back to the second part of our program with the prize ceremony. I will now pass over to Professor Nayef Al-Rodhan to introduce the members of the jury for this 2022 Innovation Prize.
Thank you, Paul. Welcome back from the break. Now we'll go into the second part of the Innovation Day at GCSP, which is the prize for innovation in global security. We started this prize 8 years ago here at GCSP, and the idea was to seek and encourage innovations in global security. And it has been awfully successful over the past 8 years. This year, for example, we had 157 applicants from all 6 continents. Very diverse, very difficult to pick the top 3, but we managed with the help of our distinguished jury. And maybe I can mention the distinguished names. So in addition to Ambassador Greminger and myself, the distinguished Ambassador Gabriel Lückinger, who's the head of international security at the FDFA. Very, very good to see you, Ambassador. Thank you for your help with the markings. General Andre Blattman, who is the former chief of the Swiss Armed Forces. Andre is always around and helpful. We're very grateful to him. Angela Kane, former senior UN official and now senior fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament. Professor Jane Royston, who's an entrepreneur and a member of the Swiss Council. And Laura Anderson, an entrepreneur now and a former senior FBI executive. Please join me in thanking our very distinguished and eminent group of jurors for their really highly dedicated help for the prize. Paul, I give back to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Al-Rodhan. It's now my pleasure to announce the winners of the prize draw seats to the 2023 Geopolitics and Global Futures Symposium, which will take place, as you can see, on 18th, 19th, and 20th October 2023. So 3 of you have been lucky enough to win seats in the prize draw. The third prize, which is 1 free seat to 1 module of the symposium, the winner is Mr. Mahmoud Abdel Hakim Ibrahim. Congratulations. The second prize, which actually gives a right to 2 modules of the symposium, was won by Frau Irina Novikova. Congratulations. And finally, the first prize for 3 seats, 3 modules at the symposium was won by Mr. Patrick Wall. Congratulations. So I'll now hand over to our colleague, Christine Garnier-Simon, who is going to announce the winner for the 3rd place in the Innovation Prize.
Thank you, Paul. I'm delighted to announce that the project that won the 3rd place in the 2022 GCSP Prize for Innovation in Global Security is Cyber Attacks in Times of Conflict Platform Ukraine, submitted by the CyberPeace Institute in Geneva. They receive a GCSP Certificate of Recognition. Our warmest congratulations to the CyberPeace Institute for submitting an excellent project. And I would now like to give the floor to Emma Raffray of the CyberPeace Institute for a few words. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Christine. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. The CyberPeace Institute is really grateful to the Geneva Center for Security Policy for awarding us with this prize for innovation in global security. I accept the prize on behalf of the Institute's CEO, Stéphane Duguin, and our extended team of researchers, analysts, developers, communication experts, and volunteers who've worked tirelessly on this project. The Cyber Attacks in Times of Conflict platform provides insights on how cyber attacks, incidents, and operations since the invasion of Ukraine impact civilians. And since the invasion in February, the Institute's been documenting cyber attacks related to the armed conflict. We launched the publicly accessible platform in June, and since then have aggregated and analyzed data on more than 700 cyber attacks affecting some 22 sectors in 35 different countries. The Institute's tracking cyber attacks that target critical infrastructure, essential for the survival of the civilian population and civilian objects, and targets that have been impacted by cyber attacks as a result of the war and its associated economic and geopolitical context. In armed conflicts, monitoring the harm to civilians is critical, and this is the aim of the platform for which we're receiving the prize today. Identifying and documenting cyber attacks is crucial, whether they make the headlines or not. Cyber attacks on the civilian population and on infrastructure essential for its survival cause differing degrees of harm, from undermining trust in institutions, disrupting core civilian and humanitarian services, spreading disinformation, preventing or impeding communication, and breaching large amounts of personal data. On the battlefields of the 21st century, cyber attacks are changing the way war is waged. Attacks on critical infrastructure, whether energy production and distribution, information systems, or transportation networks, are highly disruptive, and all are protected under international humanitarian law during situations of armed conflict. The scale of the use of cyber as a means of warfare is unprecedented. This is a new era, and it has enormous implications for the international security, laws, and norms due to the unique characteristics of cyberspace. In the future, it will be important to use information on cyber attacks to identify developments or clarifications of the law in relation to the use of cyber operations in armed conflicts and for accountability in any future judicial proceedings. Many thanks again to Ambassador Thomas Greminger and Professor Nayef Al-Rodhan, members of the jury, and to the Institute's wider community for the recognition and support in this prize. Thank you.
Well, congratulations to the CyberPeace Institute for this win. It is now my pleasure to announce the winners of second place in the 2022 competition for the GCSP Innovation Prize in Security. And the winners of that second place are Sophia, the world's first chatbot empowering survivors of domestic violence, a project that was submitted by Spring Act, Action, Compassion, and Technology. As you can see, they win the GCSP Certificate of Recognition, and it is now my pleasure to pass over to the speakers for the Spring Act team, Ms. Rhiana Spring and Simon Sundaraj.
Thank you. Dear guests, dear jury, 1 in 3 women and many men experience domestic violence in their lifetime. This means that every single person in this room knows someone that has suffered or is suffering from abuse. This recognition is for those survivors of domestic violence. Please know that we hear you, that we believe you. We developed this digital companion, Sophia, for you, ready to help you find help in over 222 countries, 24/7, completely anonymously, and in 13 languages, all without leaving a digital trace. This has now been recognized as an innovation in global security for the feature of the digital safe that will help you gather potential evidence of the abuse happening wherever you are. My deepest gratitude to all the survivors who have helped us in this process, and to our incredible tech team, including Jada Fallo, Steve Phillips, Jojo Kaloga, Simon Sandaraj, and together with over 80 volunteers who have made this innovation a possibility and reality. This is for you, dear survivors everywhere. Thank you, GCSP, for this recognition. Now let's join forces and together let's move mountains. Be the light for change with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rhiana Spring, and to, of course, your whole team, congratulations for this second place. And I will now hand over to Professor Nayef Al-Rodhan, who will be announcing the first place winners.
Thank you, Paul. Congratulations to third and second place winners, very impressive projects. And just to remind you, for the 3 winners to have won out of 157 applicants from 6 continents is no small feat, so very well done. Now it's my pleasure to announce on behalf of the jury and GCSP and my program and tireless team, the winning project for first place prize entitled Off Ramps, Averting Nuclear Use in Crisis and War, to be presented by Dr. Rishi Paul from the British American Security Information Council. Dr. Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. On behalf of BASIC, I'd like to thank members of the jury for choosing BASIC as this year's winner. I'm sure it was a very difficult decision to make, given the tough level of competition. The other 2 projects sound absolutely fantastic, and we look forward to learning more about it. I'd also like to thank 2 members of BASIC, Dr. Gree Thomason and Marion Messmer, who have joined us today. They helped with the development of this project plan. Marion has since left BASIC and is now at Chatham House. Unfortunately, BASIC director Paul Sebastian Brixey Williams couldn't be here today, but he sends his best. So the Off-Ramps project is built around the idea that nuclear weapons persist as an existential threat, and the risk of limited nuclear use and wider general nuclear war is greater today than at any point since the Cold War. The danger remains that as long as the nuclear possessors lack the ability to pivot, to off-ramp from nuclear use during the critical stages of a nuclear crisis and in war, they may be tempted or feel compelled to use nuclear weapons to ensure regime survival, win the war, or manipulate shared risks in a brazen attempt to bolster aggressive opportunities for aggrandizement. Despite what some nuclear strategists may profess, nuclear use can never be localized or limited, and the consequences of a broken nuclear taboo remain too worrisome to accept. Given the increasing risk of clashes between nuclear possessor states, the critical need to off-ramp as a mechanism to de-escalate from the nuclear option, whilst also not giving into aggression, is a complex objective and challenge, mission critical to preserving global security. To meet this need, this project is aimed at developing an authoritative, practical toolkit and framework to assist policy practitioners in planning nuclear off-ramps to avert nuclear weapons use during times of tension or conflict. Development of this policy resource will give mankind a vital lifeline to segue into safety during critical phases, and in so doing, curtail the erroneous need for leaders to consider the actual use of nuclear weapons. No tool like this exists, although the need to pioneer its creation holds promise for achieving outsized global impact. Currently, off-ramps remains an abstract concept with no agreed upon definition. Frequently referenced as a key characteristic of the Cuban Missile Crisis, its innate value lies in its ability to de-escalate from near nuclear use during periods of acute nuclear tension and heightened risk. I look forward to discussing more about this project with you. So once again, thank you very much for deciding BASIC for this award. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Paul. We really appreciate and congratulations, of course, on this first place, winning the 2022 Innovation Prize. Of course, our thanks must go to, of course, all of the jury members, the contestants, and the winners. Of course, congratulations to you all. We're now going to take a few moments to return to each of our three winning teams in order to have a few more interviews about their projects, so you can all learn a little bit more about them as well. And as you may have seen from the information on the screen, you can also raise some questions through the Q&A section, which I'll be happy to read. We'll have approximately time for about 3 questions for each team, so please bear with me on this as well. I believe from the program we're starting with our third place winners, CyberPeace Institute. So of course, you've explained to us a little bit, of course, the context in which you elaborated this project. Maybe a first question we might ask is, how are you sourcing the data for this platform whose purpose you've explained to us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Paul. Actually, the information that we're putting into the platform is all sourced from publicly available data or information. And for this, we're sourcing from a number of different entities or platforms. So one of these is governments using information from CERTs, for example, sourcing from international and national media across different regions. We're also sourcing a lot of data from social media, such as Twitter and Telegram channels, which are used quite extensively by different threat actors in the context of the war. We're also using information from technical reports, notably published by a lot of different private actors or private companies who've been doing technical analysis, research, and attribution related to cyber attacks. We also source information directly from targeted victims, notably in the form of statements, and also looking at other existing aggregated data sets that are out there related to this problematic. And just to note that we've also developed quite a strong methodology in terms of categorizing the certainty of incidents based on not only on the source itself, but also on the provenance of the information in relation to whether the information related to the incident is known directly to the source or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Just checking our questions, but for the moment, they're for our next teams. Of course, might you also want to say a few words about what are the trends you're seeing with your monitoring?
Yeah, absolutely. So really in the context of the conflict, we've sort of grouped together the types of incidents and threats that we're seeing into 4 categories. So the first one are destructive attacks, which have been happening predominantly through the use of wiper malwares, which are actually destroying data and systems on a more permanent basis than some of the other attacks we've seen. Then we've seen attacks of a disruptive nature, which are primarily composed of distributed denial of service attacks, but we've also seen cases of ransomware deployed. There's also been data weaponization attacks, where we've seen especially a lot of private companies that have been hacked and then their information leaked in publicly accessible forums. And then we've also seen a lot of attacks related to the spread of disinformation and propaganda, such as the defacement of websites or attacks against media organizations. A few other things that we've actually seen that have been particularly notable in the context of this war have been the mobilization of so-called hacking collectives and how these different actors are coming together and merging together to be able to commit campaigns of attacks against organizations. And we've seen this happening in terms of collectives that are both pro-Russian but also pro-Ukrainian. And we've also seen, really, in terms of the types of sectors that have been targeted, we've seen a significant number of attacks against public administrations, but also financial, media, transportation, ICT, and the energy sectors, all of which are sectors that actually have a very real impact on civilians when their services are disrupted.
Thank you. And I see we have a raised hand from our jury member, Lauren Anderson. So please ask your question, Lauren.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, Emma, for the wonderful work that you and your team have done. The question that I had is, you've done tremendous collection. You've got a great repository, great analysis going on. So I'm curious as to how you would envision using this going forward. Do you anticipate it being used to inform policymakers on a global level, on a bilateral level? What do you see with all of this wonderful work going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. That's a really good question. So absolutely, there's the idea that the data could be used for policymakers, both nationally and internationally. So we've actually been in contact with some of the national entities who are actually interested in the data that we're collecting and how this could be used for them. But also looking at how the data could be used in terms of assessing how international humanitarian law and international law could be applied in the context of some of these attacks. And we're also looking at how this data could be used in terms of judicial proceedings in the future. And we have been having some bilateral conversations with regards to that. And I suppose an extra one that I should mention, we've actually had quite a lot of outreach from different academic organizations who are interested in using this data in relation to the different types of research that they are doing on the conflict that might not be related specifically to cyber attacks, but could be related more to kinetic or physical attacks, who are interested in actually using our data as parallel sources for the research that they're doing.
Thank you very much. And congratulations.
Thank you.
No, I believe we still have maybe one question, but as we want to be sure we have enough time to have all of the teams go, of course, any of the questions that we haven't managed to treat in the discussion will, of course, be shared with the winning teams for a further follow-up interview. So apologies if you haven't had time to put in your question, but it's been duly noted, and as I was saying, it will be shared with the winning team. I'd now like to move on to the team from Spring Act, and to Ms. Rhiana Spring. Well, I already have several questions regarding your project as well. Some of them are, of course, more, sorry. particularly directed to some of the experiences you've been conducting in Senegal. But perhaps maybe one of the first questions we can ask on that are, what are some of the experiences and stories from the application in various countries? And then we can return also to questions in more detail with your Senegalese experience, if you mind.
Thank you. Really good questions. I've been reading them on the side as well. It's been very interesting, the responses from different countries. We don't hear directly from users because it's completely anonymous, but we have survivors reaching out to us to tell us how grateful they would have been if they had Sophia when they were in an abusive relationship, and that they all believe that this is the red thread throughout all of it. No matter where they are, they believe they would have left their relationship earlier if they could have spoken to someone like Sophia that is anonymous. So the threshold to reaching out for help is so high. So even though, like I said, 1 in 3 women experience domestic violence, only 60% ever seek help, and only 10% ever go to the police. And one of the reasons is it's so difficult to even admit this to yourself, let alone even a friend or a social worker. So being able to do this in the safety of your own home without actually anybody knowing is a huge plus. So that's what we've gotten as feedback from many different countries. From more of an organizational level, it's been very interesting because we have launched in Peru and we are now in talks with Senegal, and in the global south, the excitement and the willingness to adopt Sophia is much higher than in the global north in our experience so far. And not only wanting it there, but also with the funding. It will look like the funding will come more from the global south than the global north, which we like to see as the kind of changing the view on the divide of our world.
Well, thank you very much. On that aspect, I think that the next few questions, they were oriented about the case about Senegal, but perhaps if you mentioned some of the other global South countries in which you're experimenting, I think the questions might actually apply in both cases as well. So the 2 questions I had here were in respect to for instance, in Senegal, what would be then what would be the cultural barriers that users may be facing when using the app, even in that country, and then perhaps that might be the basis for the other question, which is then what would be the next phase of development for your project in that specific country with the lessons learned.
It's a very good question. I've asked that about the cultural barriers. This is really, so it goes well together. So we always launch in a new country only with a domestic violence organization that is local there. We would never launch into a country that we don't have that partnership with. So they tell us exactly that. What are the cultural barriers? What are the cultural norms that we need to take into consideration? With a lot of countries in the global south, and definitely Senegal, my deputy director, Jojo Kaloga, is Senegalese, and we work with a survivor of a quite big story as well, very closely, who is also from Senegal. And the biggest barrier there is it's more community oriented, so more family oriented than maybe in the global north. So passing that threshold, not only for you individually, but you as a family, and breaking up these 2 families if you're married is very high, as well as the general system of support. It's not good anywhere. It's not good in Switzerland, the support for survivors of domestic violence, and it's even less in countries that are less wealthy than we are, for example, in Switzerland. But the biggest barrier is definitely exactly the cultural differences between the countries and the community, the orientation of more towards community than individualism. So yeah, running into the second question, that would be the number 1 step is finding a domestic violence organization partner that we can partner with, that kind of guides us through this and lets us know what we need to look at and who we need to contact. That we have a local partner now in Senegal. We're in a second step, which we're also currently doing, is in partnership talks with other organizations for reaching more survivors of domestic violence throughout the country, but also for funding. And a third step is translating Sophia into local languages. So currently Sophia is just on the verge of being translated in additional languages local to Senegal, which is Wolof, Serer, and Peul, and potentially even more depending on how our research goes.
Well, thank you very much. I believe that is all I had for you, but as with the other teams, if there are any more questions coming in the middle, we'll be forwarding them to you. So of course, congratulations as well. And we're now, of course, going to the prize winners, to Dr. Rishi Paul and some of his collaborators who've joined as well. Congratulations, of course, on winning first place, and you've told us already quite a lot of what you'll be doing. We also have a range of questions for you as well. The first one would be, how is BASIC going to ensure the acceptability of off-ramps toolkit to a wide range of actors?
Sure, that's a great question. So part of the problem is always going to be acceptance, but development of this policy resource is not in isolation from nuclear possessor and non-nuclear possessor states. Part of our theory or working hypothesis is that because a nuclear crisis can never be contained, it will always include other actors. Other actors have a vested interest. So in that sense, states, and I'm just throwing one out there, let's say, for instance, Canada. Canada as a state might have particular resources that are vital for as off-ramp components, which is fundamental in averting nuclear use between actors. So we aim to bring in a pool of states together to work collaboratively. To achieve this, we will develop what's called the Nuclear Off-Ramps Advisory Panel, which brings in stakeholders that we believe have a vested interest from different communities to be involved in development of off-ramps, and then to disseminate the toolkit within target states, to host briefings, but also to have a nuclear crisis simulation exercise, which will involve obviously a hypothetical scenario, but by inviting officials from target states, we hope that we can seed interest in off-ramps as a credible alternative.
Thank you very much. Well, the next question I've received was asking you, in what ways does the planned toolkit differ from other risk reduction measures, for example, such as those envisioned by the Stockholm Initiative?
Sure. So traditionally, risk reduction typically focuses on increasing predictability and lessening the possibility for misinterpretation. So accordingly, a host of risk reduction proposals have targeted the lack of knowledge surrounding nuclear doctrines, postures, and intentions. Whereas risk reduction measures typically focus on ensuring a crisis and war between nuclear possessors does not happen, a number of confidence-building measures will cease utility should escalation cause a tremor and conflict transitions abruptly from a crisis and into phases of war or nuclear use. In this context, this project is situated within the critical need to develop a first protocol or space for decision makers to segue into should escalation engulf a crisis or war breaks out between nuclear possessors and nuclear options become a consideration. This objective represents the creation of a new level in risk reduction and nuclear crisis management, and is entirely distinct from mainstream thinking and other projects. Secondly, and I think despite the canon of risk reduction and crisis management literature, at present, there remains a distinct lack of information available to policy practitioners on how to develop and communicate off-ramp proposals during the various stages of a crisis, during conventional war, and in between nuclear fire breaks. Whilst during and after the Cold War, academic research developed a rich set of ideas and theories around crisis management, these were mostly rooted in the context of a nuclear crisis, the crucial interim between peace and war, but rarely considered during the onset of actual war and near nuclear use.
Thank you. And the third question I had that was addressed to you as well was from the preliminary research that you've conducted so far, is it possible to identify some core ingredients and conditions that enable the de-escalation from nuclear option in the past?
Well, that's a great question. So I believe that there are two essential components that we know of already that are essential for the functioning of off-ramps. So we can look to the past as a lens and see that President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev's groundbreaking 1962 nuclear off-ramp contained perennial components. For instance, the United States was able to shift the Soviet perception that the potential benefits of exercising restraint would be comparatively better than the potential costs of escalating. Therefore, as a working hypothesis, we can therefore deduce that the ability to shift perceptions into a shared understanding of what is at stake is an essential component for the successful functioning of nuclear off-ramps. In offering off-ramps as an alternative to nuclear use, possessor states can therefore forge the optimal conditions for the benefit of an adversary to avoid nuclear escalation, and also provide an opportunity to withdraw if the risks of escalation outweigh the potential reward. I believe that the second essential off-ramps component is a golden bridge, Sun Tzu's famous term for a face-saving formula that preserves an opponent's dignity and respect, but without reward, and its seamless convergence with shared strategic victories. These two components need to be tailored in such a manner that they can help opponents save face and provide logical reasoning to the international and domestic audiences as to why there is a shift from conflict to cooperation. Again, this belief is underscored by the 1962 off-ramps. The crisis was diffused and the Soviet missiles removed when President Kennedy committed the United States into a non-invasion pledge of Cuba, and a secret deal was agreed to remove US Jupiter missiles in Turkey. These components, consisting of a face-saving outlet and shared strategic victories, ensured that neither leader had to make a humiliating climb down. Now, I believe that there are other off-ramp components that can be identified by looking at other case studies. So these case studies would be Berlin, 1948, 1961, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Yom Kippur War, Twin Peaks, 2001, and Balakot airstrikes between India and Pakistan in 2019. By investigating and looking into these case studies and trying to identify and isolate the optimal conditions and core ingredients that led to de-escalation, we can then take those components and synthesize it for political application into a toolkit, a sort of menu of options that allows policymakers to draw upon in times of crisis.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Paul, for all of these answers as well. As you know, we're, of course, running on Swiss precision time, so I'm actually finding that we're even a few minutes ahead from schedule from our originally closing time. But before concluding, I was wondering, well, I think I've read through the list of the questions in the chat box, but if in any case any of the participants or the jury members would like to again raise their hands or ask some questions or make some sort of a closing statement, we have time for that for any of the teams. Well, I'm not seeing any volunteers. But well, you know, I think we've learned a great deal this afternoon, not only, of course, from the webinar, but also from the three winning projects that we have distinguished this year, and they are going to try to make a difference in so many different ways in respect to the different problems that we are seeing in our world. So really, again, I want to congratulate all of the teams who had their projects successfully recognized and prized this year. It's been a real pleasure to look at all of these projects as well. Obviously, of course, it's be fair to congratulate also to all of the contestants who've entered the prize as well. And hope that they will remain inspired to keep working for good today. Well, obviously, before closing, a few words of recognition for everyone involved in this year's Innovation Prize. So, of course, the competitors, the organizers, the jury members, and the GCSP staff who, of course, made this live event possible this afternoon. And so, of course, it's again been a great pleasure to be working with you on this annual project that recognizes innovation in international security. So this brings our proceedings to a close for today. We'll be looking forward to seeing you again soon, perhaps in the next editions of the prize next year, and of course also at the Geopolitics and Global Futures Symposium in next October. So thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I wish you a very pleasant remainder of the evening, and for the moment it will be goodbye from us all at the GCSP.